Everyone. Welcome back to the Mind of Sai Marie. I'm your host, Sai Marie Johnson. Today, we are exploring the nuances of the human condition through the lens of short fiction. Joining me is an author whose latest work captures the messy, gorgeous, and sometimes painful reality of existence. Please welcome the author of The Beauty and the Hell of It and Other Stories, Lynda Williams. Lynda, I am so glad to have you at the table today.
It's lovely to be here. I'm excited.
So, your collection, The Beauty and the Hell of It and Other Stories, has such a visceral title. What was the common thread that connected these specific stories for you during the curation process?
As I was writing the book, I didn't have that title in mind. I had tentatively titled it Don't Look Back in Anger, referencing the Oasis song. So, really, what I was thinking about was angry women. But when I got to the end of it, I realized the complexity of the emotions in these stories it goes so far beyond anger. I needed something entirely different.
I really like that, especially with you adding in that a song inspiration was the first working title. So, short stories require an immediate emotional hook. How do you approach building a complete world and meaningful character arc in such a condensed space?
With as little thought as possible. For me, the thing that comes first is always voice. It's usually interior dialogue. Sometimes it's dialogue between characters, but everything just flows from there. I don't visualize much when I'm writing. It's very much me putting down what I hear, and then conflict, plot, everything else just flows from.
So the title suggests a duality of experience. In your writing, do you find it more difficult to capture the moments of beauty or the moments of hell?
Beauty, always. I think there's a temptation to overwrite things that are meaningful to us in a beautiful way because we want people to share that feeling, whether it's affection for something or admiration. So, yeah, I don't feel that same temptation to overwrite things that are distressing. Yeah, it's really important to me to leave as much as possible to subtext in the short story form. And I risk not doing that when it comes to beautiful moments.
So many of these stories deal with raw human vulnerability. How much of your personal journey is woven into the fabric of this collection?
Now, the characters are all made up. What happens to the characters is more familiar to me, sometimes related to things I've experienced or witnessed other people experience. But I would say the real betrayal of my own life comes in the details. Something I noticed about a sunset, someone's car I rode in once, those type of things, because those were harder to imagine, at least for me.
As a writer releasing a collection in 2026, how do you feel the short story format competes with the modern binge culture of long form novels?
Apples and oranges. I mean, I have to agree that when I read a novel, if there's any way I can make it happen, I want to do it in one sitting. And I would argue that short stories, although faster to read, are actually demanding more of readers because I think more does happen within subtext. Often, when I come away from a short story, I'm staggering away wondering, how did the writer do this to me? And I'm left thinking and wondering. And there's just this whole bubble that I live in after I read a good short story, trying to work out the meaning of it. And I don't have that experience as frequently with novels. I don't know. It's a lot to ask in our Instagram, social media, scrolling world to ask people to sit down with a short story and wrestle with it for hours and days after they've actually finished reading it. So, as much as I would like for there to be a revival in the popularity of short stories, I do think they're at a disadvantage simply because they demand more of readers.
Some of your stories lean into the surreal, while others are deeply grounded. How do you decide which tone a particular narrative seed needs to grow?
I don't make the decision consciously. It's very much dictated by the characters. I'm always starting from a place of play and, well, what if? So that is what leads me in one direction or the other. And then when I come to revise, I have to start asking myself the hard questions about, is this working for the particular story? Does this fit with this character?
You often explore the themes of consequence and memory. Why are these specific elements so central to your storytelling voice?
Memory is important to me because I look at it as how we tell ourselves the story of our lives. And I think we're constantly reinventing this story. And I don't consider memory to be particularly reliable, which is a fun thing to play with in short stories because it adds a whole layer of, well, what is real, right? In terms of consequence, it's not something I had ever considered as one of my themes. So it's kind of novel to sit back and wonder, well, how does that play out? For me, I think it's almost a function of plot that in order to make writing interesting, you need your characters to make bad decisions. Yes, consequences need to arise, otherwise, you don't have a story.
So, when you finish a story that is particularly hellish or heavy, what is your process for decompressing and stepping out of that character's headspace?
That's something else I should give more thought to. I think it would be very healthy to take a walk, get some exercise, do some gardening. But honestly, usually when I come away from any story, I have this sense of loss almost because I know that I'm done working with a particular set of characters. And I also have this imposter syndrome where the first question that pops into my head is, will you ever be able to pull this off again? So I come away from a particularly heavy story with the heaviness and that sense of grief. And I usually end up burying myself in old movies, ones where the ending is familiar, where I know the characters, movies that don't require anything of me emotionally. And yeah, I'll watch those on repeat until I'm sick of it and ready to write something again.
Gotta love those warm and cozy movies. Researching for a collection can be scattered. Was there a specific fact or historical tidbit that inspired one of the standout pieces in your book?
I actually did most of the research, which was rather sparse after. When I'm writing, I choose to follow the story and then put the square brackets in that, hey, you don't know much about this. You should probably look it up. So I can't say that any of the stories were inspired by research. There was one story titled Blind Date that was inspired by a tweet. Jimmy Fallon used to do the hashtag thing, and people would share their experiences based on the call out. And this particular call out was about the worst date someone had ever had. And this gentleman named Scott wrote in and he said that he had this blind date and the woman he was supposed to meet sat down, did not say a word, scarfed down all her food, got up and left. And then a few minutes later, another woman sat down and introduced herself, and that was his actual date. And I was like, well, how does this happen? Like, how can you pull off that kind of stunt, right? Because somebody had to know that he was waiting for a blind date to be able to take advantage of him for this meal. And that's where the story came from.
So, that's a very interesting story. Definitely kind of leads into my next question. For new readers, which story in The Beauty and the Hell of It do you think perfectly encapsulates your style as an author?
I would say it's actually everything after. And I don't know if it perfectly encapsulates where I began, but it shows, I think, who I grew into as a writer over the period of time it took to collect these stories. And the stories do span approximately 15 years. The first story I wrote is actually the first story in the book, Matches, which was circa 2008, 2009. And then this last story, Everything After, was written after I signed a contract for the book and added to the collection.
That kind of goes into the next question I have. How has your why for writing changed between your first written piece and the release of this collection?
You know, shockingly little. In the beginning, when I was starting out with short stories, some of the feedback I got about my main characters was I didn't like her. And it threw me for a loop because I started asking myself, well, is that a thing? Are you supposed to like the main character? I don't think that Raymond Carver was worried about this. Why am I supposed to worry about it? So that was at the front of my mind. I wanted to write women in particular who weren't likable. And that's something I still like to lean into. So there's that. But if I think about the heart of my why, it always comes back to me writing for myself and writing the stories I want to hear that might not be getting told.
So, for aspiring authors who are intimidated by the finality of a short story ending, what advice do you have for knowing exactly when a story is actually finished?
You know, Elisa York has talked about endings for short stories, and she compares them to the tail on a cat. And if you think about it, right, it's all vertebrae attached. So if there's something happening with the ending that you feel like, it doesn't quite fit, I'm not sure I'm finished, it often means you need to revisit the middle and sometimes the beginning of your story because it's baked in.
That makes sense. Now that this collection is out in the world, are you returning to short fiction next, or is there a full length novel brewing on the horizon?
So the plan was to return to short fiction. It is my favorite. And what happened there is I wrote a few stories and then I wrote one that I shared with some peers. And they said, Lynda, I think this story contains a novel. So that is precisely what I'm working on now. I don't know what's going to come of it, but I have this lovely short story that gave me a set of characters that I felt deserved more space.
Wow, that's awesome to hear. So, finally, for the creative who feels pulled between the light and dark aspects of their work, what is your advice for finding that sweet spot where honesty meets artistry?
That one's tricky. I don't think it's something that you can prescriptively say this is the formula for achieving that. I think you have to be willing to write badly in order to get there, to be potentially overwrought or a lot of the time the feedback I was getting as I was working through these stories was we need more vulnerability. Women are sassy, they're sarcastic, but too much cleverness can interfere with what you're reaching for if you're dealing with heavy topics. So I think when you come to revise, you do have to ask yourself, am I being coy? Am I being funny for a reason that serves the story? Or am I doing this because I'm trying to distance myself from a topic that feels really heavy and I'm not confident handling? It's been lovely chatting. Thank you for having me.